the 29-point plan on the part of the United States. They have proposed a 29. It seems that they have reduced it after the meeting Rubio had in Geneva with Europeans and Ukrainians. They have reduced it, as Donald Trump mentioned. We thought that it would be 19 points, and but Donald Trump today said that it's going to be 22 points. But after all, looking at the document, what is your take on what's going on with the document?
The important thing to realize is it's not a peace proposal. It's not a plan at all. It's a bold attempt to shape the terms in which the public views the entire Ukrainian coup d'etat at the Maidan in February 2014, followed by the whole Ukrainian attack on the Russian-speaking population and the last almost 3 years of war. It's a fight to shape public opinion, and it's, in that sense, a brilliant propaganda attack. President Putin and Foreign Minister Lavrov have given speech after speech explaining the whole history, explaining how the Russians intend to end the war when they win and they create a new government free of the Nazis, free of the Russia haters, and disarm Ukraine and prevent it from joining NATO. What the NATO and the Americans have done is, instead of just giving a different speech and saying, okay, here's your narrative, here's ours, they've capsulated their answer and their counter argument and their counter narrative in the form of a point by point, listing by listing, is if it's a proposed articles of agreement. And of course, these articles will never be agreed upon. There's no way in which either Russia or NATO, Europe, and the United States, not to mention Zelensky's government in Ukraine, can accept them. So the purpose is not to get any agreement at all. It's to make people think in terms of, how do we view what's happening? What's the war all about? Who's responsible for it? And these points have been crafted by propagandists to sort of win the hearts and minds of the people in support of the Maidan coup. And the aim has been sort of leaked to the press, going all the way back to reverse the way of how World War II ended. What Europe wants to do is say, we want to refight the end of World War II. And already in 1944, Churchill was saying, let's, as soon as the war is over, let's attack the Soviet Union. Europe said, well, let's go back to that point. 1944, okay, that's 80 years ago. Let's see whether we can refight at that point. Now we can attack attack Russia. That's really what all of it's about. And it's outrageous trick. It's been carefully thought out and propagandized. And so the peace proposal is not intended to bring peace. It's just a propaganda charade at pretending to negotiate peace. And it's really a propaganda effort. And in a word, the aim is to essentially obfuscate what is really happening. By the way, Foreign Minister Lavrov said yesterday at a French news conference that Europe's, quote, elites opted for war and have staked their entire political careers on the slogan of inflicting what they call a strategic defeat on Russia, unquote. Well, that's failed. So NATO realizes it's lost the war. It doesn't have the arms to fight. You've seen the Russian advance accelerating day after day. So NATO says, well, okay, we'll lose the war. How do we win the peace? And that's going to be, how is history and current voters going to look at what's been happening? What is all of this about? And if you look at the US press, the New York Times and the Washington Post and the British press. It's which side of the fight is analogous to the Nazis and Hitler. You In the New York Times yesterday, you have Friedman talking about how can Trump appease Hitler? Trump is a Putin's puppet. These agreements are really Russia's demands. Well, of course, they're not Russia's demands before. You can read the Russian demand and what Putin and Lavrov have said. So I think we can, if this were really an agreement to discuss where do we go from here and how do we think about solving this fighting in Ukraine, the Article 1 should be, were there any war crimes committed? That's what it's all about. And a basic issue is, well, if they were, by whom and against whom, and who are the victims, and what were these crimes? Well, Russia has already announced that when it conquers Ukraine and installs a non-Nazi government, it's going to hold a modern Nuremberg trial. That it's going to convict parties that have committed war crime. That is what terrifies the NATO leaders, and not to mention the kleptocrats in Zelensky's regime that have enriched themselves and been embezzling the loans from Europe, the United States, and especially the International Monetary Fund to buy properties offshore and Bitcoin and the things that kleptocrats do to hide or conceal the money they've taken. Well, for the Russians, it's vitally important to establish the historical record because that's the key to what is going to be the body of international law following from all of this. Well, again and again, President Putin and Lavrov have said, we thought that the Nuremberg trials had established the international law of war crimes. We've been attacked. Russia is not the attacker. The Maidan was the attacker. The Ukrainian attack on the Russian-speaking population, the civilian population, was a war crime, breaking the rules of war. We came in to protect the Russian speakers. The populations of Ukraine, of Luhansk and Donetsk, have voted to become part of Russia, which they were in practice all the time during the Soviet Union, when there wasn't any real separate Ukrainian nation, and the Russians are basing their actions and their intentions on international law. To do this, they have to have a Nuremberg trial, a war crime trial, to reiterate, well, what is the appropriate international law to deal with a situation such as we've been fighting for more than 2 years in Ukraine. And the West says, well, it was Russia that's the attacker. Russia's committed the war crime, and that's a travesty of what's happening. But it's the aim of the U.S. and NATO narrative, sort of to turn the war into a new Cold War propaganda weapon against Russia, aimed at turning the world against Russia and supporting the Western Europe. So, in practical terms, it's to protect the Ukrainians and neo-Nazis and the European backers, to whitewash all the corruption that's been occurring during this. And a major aim of the Ukrainian Nazis has been to avoid punishment. They want to leave Ukraine with the money that they've embezzled and stored away, and go to their British mansions and Mediterranean castles. So the US, NATO proposal calls for blanket amnesty. And if there indeed were a war crime, then there shouldn't be an amnesty for everyone. If a criminal breaks the law, then the criminal must be arrested and put away, not merely to punish them for what they've done in the past, but to protect the present population from having them continue to commit crimes. Well, that committing crimes is exactly what the NATO West wants to do against Russia, against China, against Venezuela, against Iran, and against any country that is resisting the US dominated world order. So all of this jockeying for how do we determine the terms of peace? Is it all, we're just going to forget everything? Are we going to blame Russia, or are we going to blame the United States and NATO? All of this is what's at stake in all of this. Well, I can elaborate. The original proposal called for Ukraine to investigate corruption. The Wall Street Journal a few days ago reported that the Ukrainians insisted on changing the language to say that all countries will receive, quote, full amnesty for their actions during the war. Well, the actions are not only the war crimes, staging false flags like the Bucha stage, but for the crimes of embezzlement. The World Bank, the Europeans, all have agreed that NATO is the most corrupt country in the Northern Hemisphere, and it has been ever since 1991, ever
You
since.
mean you mean Ukraine is the most corrupt?
Yes, what did I say?
You said NATO. Oh, no
Oh, I'm
problem.
sorry.
Yeah.
Well, Ukraine is the most corrupt, although its corruption has been with the full participation and support of Europe. And I would imagine that any trial is going to be, is going to involve the actions of Macron and Merz and Starmer and the British in breaking up the agreement that the Ukrainians and Russians had made to end the war. Uh, a few all the way back in 2022, the agreements that were all broken and turned out to want a ceasefire just to rearm Ukraine with more NATO arms to go on fighting against Russia. That's something that Russia is never going to fall for again. So the whole idea of a ceasefire is, if that's what these proposals are about, there never was a possibility of that. And so if that was never a realistic possibility, why are they doing it? It doesn't have anything to do with creating a actual peace. As I said, it's a way to shape the categories of how people think about this whole conflict between NATO and Russia. The whole expansion of NATO, since it had promised, the Americans had promised NATO would not expand if Russia ended its military occupation of Central Europe and agreed to dissolve the Soviet Union. All of that's already happened, and I don't think Russia has any intention of trying to trust the West again. So the reality is that any real peace agreement logically has to be created after the fighting stops, not before it stops, and especially not when one side is defeating the other overwhelmingly. Trying to freeze a conflict when Russia is overwhelmingly winning is trying to solve the Ukrainian problem by just essentially just making the loser set the terms of the peace. Europe, the NATO and the United States have lost the war that they started in Ukraine, hoping that the war would drain Russia's economy, would create an economic crisis, would persuade Russian voters that we need a regime change. We've got to replace Putin for having started this war and put in a new group. And the NATO and US idea of a new group is the same neoliberal kleptocrats that they put in the 1990s. Privatize Russia, ideally break it into parts, the whole strategy against Russia. And that's just a fantasy. So how can they at least try to convince the population that this fantasy is a realistic probability and even a moral probability? So their solution is to say, well, the big picture. Who are the counterparts to World War II's Nazis in this? And we're seeing a replay of the ending of World War II. And since Russia's organizing the peace, it's in a position to hold these, what I called the new Nuremberg trials. And the NATO aim is to make people take seriously the idea that Putin is a modern Neville Chamberlain making peace with the Nazis. This comparison of uh, I'm sorry, that not Putin, to make Donald Trump look like a Neville Chamberlain. Chamberlain just surrendering to Russia. That's what Friedman had written in the New York Times. It's what the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and the network television in the United States keep saying. We're back in what started all of World War II when Chamberlain did not protest against Russia's moving into Czechoslovakia to defend the German population there. Well, if trying to say that Trump is a Chamberlain means you have the leaders of the Republicans in Congress, Mitch McConnell especially, says there's no way in which the US Congress can possibly agree to even the proposal that Trump and his staff have put on the table. So Congress has already announced this. Any agreement is going to be a no-go. The Ukrainians have said we absolutely will not cede any territory to Russia, even though Russia's conquered it, even though we have no army to defend it. We're not going to agree with that. Well, that the defeated party does not get the right to determine the terms of peace and who won and who lost. That's what war is about. As Clausewitz said, it's a continuation of policy by other means, by military means. And Russia has been obliged to use an enormous expenditure and troops to achieve this military policy of ending the NATO expansion towards trying to destroy the Russian economy and hurt it in any way it can, especially by cutting off its trade with Europe in oil and gas and other things, to seize Russia's savings that it had kept in the West in Euroclear, its foreign exchange reserves that it was using. So the that's the first issue. The second article up for discussion should not be put in terms of blaming one party or another. It should be who owes reparations to whom.